Thank you, Mike. And can I bore everyone for 30 more seconds to say, please do bid, buy a raffle ticket, donate, join, support the work that I see done by the committee members and by people with extraordinary experience and dedication astonishes me every time I dial into a meeting. So every item here has been coaxed out of people who are very generous in supporting our work, and we couldn't be more grateful. But it is, for me, a genuine privilege to be able to introduce our keynote speaker, a person whose work speaks to much of what the Voltaire Awards intend to celebrate. By way of a short, wholly unauthorised and unashamedly plagiarised biography, Nick McKenzie has worked for ABC's Four Corners program, 960 Minutes, the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. None of those are shameful newspapers in this room. His reporting spans politics, defence, foreign affairs, the criminal justice system, corporate crime and social affairs. In his 20 years as a journalist, he has been awarded the Walkley, Australia's highest journalism award, a record 14 times. And he's been named Australian Journalist of the Year on 4 occasions. Clearly no slouch, Nick is passionate about giving vulnerable people a voice. He works closely with whistleblowers and is an advocate for better laws to protect their critical role exposing corruption and wrongdoing, something that we would also strongly support. That passion and belief in the importance of whistleblowers is one of the things that has led him to spend 5 years working with Chris Masters to reveal the shame of war crimes committed by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan, and to defend himself in one of Australia's most high-profile defamation cases. His recently published book, Crossing the Line, tells the explosive inside story behind the Ben Roberts-Smith's headlines. It has been described as a testament to the power of investigative journalism, and of course is available to purchase this evening, and I think we've promised that Nick will sign copies if you track him down. Nick has told stories that people didn't want told. He's made Australians face uncomfortable truths and has held powerful to account. We applaud Nick for refusing to look away, for refusing to be silent, and for showing the courage to hold those powerful to account. Please welcome Nick McKenzie.
Good evening, everybody. My great pleasure to be here. I've been asked to talk for a while about raffle tickets. I'd like to say that I'm thrilled to be in a room full of lawyers, but after enduring, and some real people do, after enduring 101 days of the defamation trial of the century and getting to know the unrivalled passion for billing at our law firm Interellison, I'm not actually sure how thrilled I am. I've been sued many times. I've been sued by that doyen of industrial relations law and construction law, Mick Gatto. I've been sued by the head of Melbourne's mafia, Tony Madaffrey, the alleged head. And yet, I love the law because I've seen it many times as a tool for justice, especially when lawyers and barristers see the virtues of the press and see their work as a fight for something bigger. The work recognised here tonight says it all. So, Sophie Trevor, what an absolute inspiration. In an early brush with the law as a very young journalist, I'll never forget walking into Equity Chambers, 21 years old. The elevator was manned by a woman who'd worked in that lift longer than I was alive. I stepped out and there was criminal defence barrister Lenny Hartnett. "Hello, comrade," he said. Next, he tipped me into a great story about his bikie client, a bandito called Kim Sloan, who'd been set up by the then Victorian drug squad. Hartnett saw his job as not only barrister, but as an advocate to hold the state to account. That sometimes meant guerrilla lawyering, like using the press. "They're moving more gear and pseudo than the Moran crime family," Lenny whispered to me. Took me a moment to realise he was talking about the police drug squad and not the Banditos. Kim Sloan was the first senior bikie I'd met, and I remember two things clearly about our first interactions. I remember him fairly aggressively on the phone telling me he'd only do the interview with the ABC 7:30 report if he got something in return, be it money or some other largesse. And I remember his expression when I arrived at his house in Geelong and handed over 2 bananas and pyjamas posters. Hang on, they're signed by B1 and B2, I told him. He paused and then erupted with laughter. The story I did with Lenny Hartnett's help and advocacy exposed how Kim Sloan had been unjustly jailed by the corrupt drug squad. Also advocating against the drug squad back in that day was Julian Birdside. I noticed him when I walked in here, a past president of Liberty Victoria, another guerrilla barrister. In a healthy democracy, the legal system and journalism need each other to function and to advance justice. So let's go to Afghanistan. The story begins back in September 2012. 45-year-old Afghan man Ali Jan says goodbye to his kids, says goodbye to his wife, heads to town on his donkey to pick up some flour, some firewood and some shoes for his youngest daughter. It's a bad day, though, to visit the town of Darwan. The SAS is sweeping through looking for an insurgent and arresting every fighting age male they encounter. That means any man capable of holding a gun. Ali Jan, an innocent villager and a farmer, is arrested. He's handcuffed. He's interrogated by a man the villagers know only as the big soldier with green eyes and sharp features. And during that interrogation, Ali Jan repeatedly denies he's Taliban. But that's not what causes him trouble. Ali Jan smiles. He smiles at the big soldier, and this infuriates him. And then he's kicked off a cliff by that big soldier with the force of a man kicking through a sturdy door. Except this door is a father of 7 who did nothing wrong but smile at the wrong time, at the wrong man. Now, this would have all remained hidden except for the morality of another soldier that day. Let's call him Jason Andrews, to respect national security orders. Jason Andrews could not get a certain vision out of his head. It was of this Afghan man. His hands were bound, flying off that edge, striking his head on a rock, his teeth exploding, blood splaying everywhere. Jason Andrews did not know his name, did not know him to be Ali Jan. He knew him only as the donkey man. I can't get it out of my head, man, he told other soldiers afterwards. I can't get it out of my head. I didn't believe it, but would you? Australia's most famous soldier, the face of the nation's contribution to Afghanistan, the pin-up boy of the Australian War Memorial, a man who'd so humbly greeted the Queen when he received the Victoria Cross. How could he have kicked an innocent civilian off a cliff? And if he'd done that, what did it say about us, Australia, and our time in Afghanistan? And I also learned very quickly that most men in the SAS have a moral conscience. One of the SAS soldiers I met in trying to report and track down this story, he was a hard man, a tough soldier. He'd tell me, Nick, I don't hesitate to drop the hammer on a 13-year-old. That meant to shoot, without equivocation, a 13-year-old if he's carrying a radio, because he could use that radio to call in an ambush. I don't hesitate to kill that person. But he said, we do not kick handcuffed civilians off a cliff. We are Australian soldiers. We are not the Taliban. And what disgusted this soldier the most was the knowledge that Ben Robert-Smith had blooded junior soldiers. What is blooding? It's the act of getting a young soldier on their first deployment to get their first kill by executing a detainee with his hands bound or shooting a civilian in the head. This man said to me, if you want to do the dirty work, if you want to kill civilians or detainees, do it yourself. Don't ruin some young trooper's life. Another hard man of the SAS would tell his own man before conflict, before combat. He said, don't be the guy who puts a dirt farmer on his knees and shoots him in the back of the head. Don't ruin your life. Don't be that guy. Jason Andrews, the soldier who'd watched Robert Smith kick the Afghan off a cliff, was one of those who was blooded in 2009 by Robert Smith, ordered to execute a detainee hands bound. But it was Ali Jan's head striking that rock. It was the donkey man's head striking that rock that changed everything. I can't get that out of my head, man. He kicked him off a cliff. I can't get it out of my head. The moment I knew it was true came like a bolt. I knew Jason Andrews was an eyewitness to this event, or at least he claimed he was. But then I learned of an SAS secondee on another continent. I learned that he was a Ben Robert-Smith fan who'd been at the village of Darwan on that fateful day. I learned he had a pretty cool nickname, at least he thought so, for Ben Roberts-Smith. I call him the Spartan Kicker, he would say, laughing. It was a reference to a film where a Spartan warrior kicks a man off the edge of a precipice. I call him the Spartan Kicker. He kicked the hell out of him. It was a damn good kick, this man would say, of what he'd witnessed. He thought Ali Jan's last few minutes made for a great belly laugh. He thought the kick made Ben Roberts-Smith even more of a war hero. 2 eyewitness accounts on 2 continents. And then I learned of other eyewitnesses in the village of Darwin itself. I learned of their account of this big soldier, Ben Roberts-Smith, 110 kilograms, 6'6", unmissable. This big soldier with green eyes and sharp features. And there was more. They didn't know any names or ranks, but this big soldier, they said, these witnesses, was wet from the waist down, covered in river sand. Only one soldier that day had crossed or waded through the Helmand River, that sandy river. That soldier was Ben Roberts-Smith. Once we had triangulated these accounts on 3 continents, we knew we'd arrived at the truth. And so we published in June 2018, and this is what followed. Billionaire Kerry Stokes gave Ben Roberts-Smith unlimited money to sue us for defamation. Stokes paid a PR team to work with News Limited journalists to relentlessly attack us. And Roberts-Smith himself began an extraordinary cover-up campaign, a campaign to defeat the legal system and the process he himself had initiated. Threatening anonymous letters were sent to a key witness. He conjured up the police to raid the family home of another witness by falsely claiming this man had guns stored at his house and might be mentally unwell or cause a massacre. He bought multiple burner phones, cell phones in other people's names, to collude with witnesses. He poured petrol on his laptops and set them on fire. He placed 6 USBs with potentially critical evidence in a pink children's lunchbox and buried that lunchbox in his family backyard under a few feet of dirt. When he sued us, we had few non-committal witnesses and, in hindsight, nil prospects of success. To fight back, we encouraged our lawyers to think like journalists, combine investigative lawyering with investigative journalism. For instance, a source provided us with the numbers of these 4 burner phones with no name attached to them, but we suspected that Roberts-Smith was using them. And a young Minter Ellison lawyer spent the weekend looking at those records, and he matched Ben Roberts-Smith's travel to Perth and to Melbourne and to Hamilton Island and overseas with the movement of these 4 burner phones hitting off certain cell towers, leading to the inescapable conclusion that they were Ben Roberts-Smith's burner phones, leading us to ask the question in trial, why does a man need 1 burner phone, let alone 4? And that pink children's lunchbox, well, it was dug up by Ben Roberts-Smith's ex-wife wearing her dressing gown, and it was given to the federal police, and finally it made its way to us. And I'll never forget plugging those USBs into my laptop and discovering photos of men drinking from a prosthetic leg, the leg of a man Ben Roberts-Smith had executed. The leg was removed and that leg became the biggest beer-drinking vessel in all of Afghanistan. And the men were so pleased with their use of it, they photographed it. This was all great credibility evidence about Ben Roberts-Smith, allowed us to advance the case. It literally buried evidence, but our case still was nothing without witnesses. And we had only a few reluctant eyewitnesses. We knew others were there. Sandy Dawson was our barrister, a conservative barrister, a classic Sydney blue blood barrister, a fine advocate, but not one to press the limits of the law or be risk averse. But we pushed Sandy to embrace that approach to the law and to see the case as something more than the defence of journalists, to see the case of something bigger, to see the case of a vehicle for Ali Jan's family to get justice. And so Sandy Dawson became more aggressive as a barrister, as an advocate than he'd ever been before. He argued for new witnesses that we'd found to be called to court, and he employed the use of discovery and subpoena like I'd never seen before. And so we had a subpoena server come to a SAS witness's house. We knew this man did not want to be called, and if an SAS witness does not want to be found, you can imagine they're pretty hard to find. But we had an ex-New South Wales cop, a counter-surveillance expert. She parked outside this man's supposed home. And finally, at 1 a.m. one day, a ute pulls in and she thought, this must be him finally coming to kiss his kids goodnight, knowing that there was a subpoena server willing or wanting to confront him. It was too late to get him then, but she stayed there all night, and he pulled his ute out at 6 a.m. in the morning, and she blocked his passage out of his driveway and served him through that little bit in the window. And we then furiously studied the law to understand if service meant throwing a document through a window, and indeed it does. But it was Sandy who was pushing for these witnesses to be found and called to court. And Sandy who convinced the judge, to agree with us that we didn't have to prove that Ben Robert-Smith had shot dead Ali Jan. We didn't know that. The eyewitness accounts were confused in that respect. That he was part of a joint criminal enterprise, such was the law in New South Wales, a famous case involving Roger Rogerson. If we could apply that law to our case, then we could implicate him in these murders nevertheless. And he argued that with ferocity, and the judge bought that. And as he argued that, he was dying because Andy Dawson had a brain tumour in his head. We didn't know it at the time, but midway through the interlocutories leading up to the trial, he started feeling ill or poorly, and the cancer was discovered, and he was given just weeks to live. And so our trial was looming. No senior counsel. Our junior counsel told me on the phone that she suffered a bad back. And I said, I don't care if you're in a wheelchair, you're going to that courtroom. But then we found Nick Owens, SC, a commercial barrister, never done a criminal case in his life, never argued defamation case in his life. But his friends in the New South Wales bar said, go with Nick. We call him Whispering Death. He doesn't say much, but what he says, it counts. And let me give you one anecdote. Ben Robert-Smith argued that the man with the prosthetic leg who was executed, who we say he executed, whose leg was removed to use as a beer drinking vessel, could never have been shot dead because he was never in a tunnel where we said he was found, and therefore was never detained and therefore was never executed. And Robert-Smith had a key witness, the man who entered the tunnel itself. And sure enough, this man, being Ben Robert-Smith's best friend and a co-accused, entered our defamation trial and said the tunnel was empty. No man with a prosthetic leg found. In fact, no man found at all. No execution, no case. And so cross-examination begins, and the night before, a young lawyer from Inter Ellison, I keep saying young lawyers because I think they're the driving force of any great legal team. If only they were paid like it. She's scrolling this man's Instagram, and she finds a post that he's placed that night before he's to give evidence on his Instagram account, and she gives this to Nick Owens. So rather than opening up his cross-examination about what happened in the tunnel and the fact there was a man there detained and executed, he says, do you post on Instagram? And his face turns a slight shade of red. And then he says, let me read you something, Mr. Witness. And he quotes from the Instagram post of this witness, when some fuckwit in a suit starts using his fucktard snake logic he learned getting his tonsils bruised by some lecturer's spotty dick at their non-binary law school, remember one thing, that this person will be one of the first to be held down and drowned in a muddy puddle for his fancy jacket. And as the witness's face drains yet some more, he stumbles and stutters. He says, obviously he's told, if you're worried on the stand about a question, ask them to repeat it. So he says, Mr. Owens, do you mind repeating that Instagram post? And the judge leans in as he does so. And yet we still had problems. Our key witness, that man who saw Ali Jan fall off that cliff, the man who was blooded himself, Jason Andrews, did not want to attend our trial. And on the eve of the trial, he pulled out, citing mental health concerns. And there was no way a judge was getting an SAS veteran, a decorated veteran, to go to a defamation case really about not much. Defamation is not the criminal law. No way a mentally unwell soldier in a mental health ward can testify for us. And our case was slipping through our hands at that time. And then COVID arrives, and I think I'm the only Victorian who cheered on the lockdown state by state. And the trial was thrown into abeyance, and the judge delayed it for 1 month and 2 months and 3 months. And finally, after 8 or so months, finally the trial resumes, and finally Jason Andrews is well. And he enters court, but we don't know if he's going to testify for Robert Smith, his brother lawyer, his comrade, a man he's been decorated with, if he's going to cover up like the man who saw nothing in the tunnel, or whether he's going to tell the truth about what happened on that day at Darwin. But step by step, he leads the judge through the donkey man's final moments. He didn't know his name, but he called him the donkey man. That's how Ali Jan arrived. The moment that he was led to that cliff edge, and the moment he saw Robert Smith kick Ali Jan off that cliff edge, and the moment he saw Ali Jan's face strike that rock, And then he described more than we'd heard before. In fact, things we'd never heard. How Robert Smith had ordered him to drag the donkey man across the dirt to the bottom of a tree. And Ali Jan had tried to stand up, but he was so injured he could not. And how Robert Smith had ordered this man to be executed by gunfire, and thus he was. And after this, he was cross-examined by Arthur Moses, SC. And Arthur Moses had a strategy of playing a video, a 60 Minutes report I'd done on Ali Jan's death, to every witness, trying to implicate them in being our confidential sources. It was a foolish strategy because as he played it to Jason Andrews, we got to see Ali Jan's photo, but more than that, we got to see his wife and his kids playing in the dirt with marbles, and his wife calling for justice and asking why her husband had been murdered, kicked off a cliff that day. And as that vision was played, Jason Andrews cried and sobbed, and the judge saw that. And that for me was a turning point in our case where I knew we're probably on a path to victory. A few quick legal points if you can endure a journalist pretending to be a lawyer. It's now a notorious fact that we won that case, but fresh from leading his failed courtroom advocacy for Ben Robert Smith, Arthur Moses SC, a darling of the Sydney bar, he claimed we were wrong to have a report on Ben Robert Smith's deeds as journalists because he was entitled to the presumption of innocence. That's what he argued before the judge when we were arguing for our costs to be paid. This argument is rubbish, but I want to raise it tonight because we hear it all the time, presumption of innocence. The eminent barrister Brett Walker SC, who's just been appointed by Ben Robert Smith to lead the appeal against the failed defamation case, has excoriated those who invoke the presumption of innocence as a way of pretending that a person is in fact innocent until they are convicted and therefore should not be subject to any public scrutiny. Walker points out the concept simply refers to the need for a prosecutor to, quote, prove beyond reasonable doubt the guilt of the accused before they are convicted in a criminal trial. Walker describes the view that a person is necessarily innocent until they are convicted in a criminal court as a form of his words, magical thinking. And he says, unfortunately, both politically and socially, in everyday language, people, many of them lawyers, speak of the presumption of innocence as if it means somehow that at the time of speaking, that is before an accused has been convicted, that the person is actually innocent, or if you like, the person is not guilty. He says, in short, the presumption of innocence involves an open mind about the outcome of a trial, but not the magical thinking that says a person is convicted, that says until a person is convicted, they are innocent. And of course, I agree with Walker. Good journalism often involves uncovering and assessing evidence underpinning very, very serious allegations against a person, allegations which may one day lead to a trial. But unlike in China or Russia, there are no laws that prevent journalists finding and publishing information about war crimes, corruption, misconduct, or the abuse of power prior to charges being laid. And if there was, we would not be living in a democracy. We'd be relying on often inept agencies to pursue the rich and the powerful and the corrupt. Eddie Obeid's corruption was exposed by journalist Kate McClymont and the New South Wales ICAC before he was eventually charged. Before he went to jail, he successfully sued Kate McClymont for defamation. Who were his lawyers? Ben Robert Smith's lawyers. If the presumption of innocence stopped the media scrutiny of any person who might one day be charged, there'd be no Me Too movement. The My Lai massacre would never have been reported, and the Abu Ghraib pictures never published, lest the soldiers seen torturing Iraqis not get a fair trial. Robert Smith has not been charged with anything, and critically our stories pointed to information the authorities had not heard, but also to the fact that the AFP in this country has a rotten record at going after alleged war criminals. In fact, the AFP's 5-year efforts to hold Robert Smith to account for his war crimes collapsed shortly after our successful victory in court because they'd used tainted evidence from the Military Inspector General evidence gained through coercive questioning. One person who contacted me after our trial outcome was Lenny Hartnett, that criminal barrister from all those years ago. A good day for justice, comrade, he told me. He was right. Lastly, a quick anecdote. We had a tremendous fixer, an Afghan journalist who helped us investigate Ben Robert Smith. And when Kabul fell after our trial, he called me trapped in Afghanistan, gunfire going off, bombs going off, and couldn't get his family. to an aeroplane, and so he fled across the border to Pakistan, back to Afghanistan, trying to get out of that country. He was a journalist, having helped Western journalists, having helped Western lawyers, our legal team. If the Taliban knew that, he could have been executed. And a year ago, I watched his family enter the water at Blair Gowrie on the front beach for the first time, stepping into an ocean for the first time, his wife and her sister, wearing their veils, fully dressed, just sat in the cold Victorian water as the ocean lapped upon them. And in a wonderful twist, one of those SAS soldiers who was deployed to Kabul after it fell to rescue Afghans that the Australian government had given visas to was one of those SAS soldiers who testified in our case, the whistleblower, bringing Afghans to Australia and doing what Ben Roberts-Smith did not do, protect the innocent. It's why I'm in awe of brave SAS whistleblowers, why I'm so proud of the SAS, why I'm in awe of Bolshe lawyers who push the limits, like Sophie Trevitt, who hold truth to power and who don't stop fighting. Buy your raffle tickets tonight. And have a great evening. Thank you very much.
Please, another big round of applause for our keynote speaker.